what I'd like to do, a little bit of time together, I've appreciated your writing for a lot of years. I started reading your stuff when I was a brand new Christian. And I know there's a lot of pastors and leaders who've been really influenced by your writing and your preaching and your teaching. And I know a recent project you published is more your backstory and your history and how it starts with your dad. I think some people are very familiar with you theologically, and I think that's very interesting to understand kind of God's work in your life. So if you'd be willing, maybe take a bit of time, tell us your history, your story, maybe start with your dad, because I think that's a very insightful piece.
The book you're referring to is called Memoirs of an Ordinary Pastor. And it came out of a realization that sometimes you go to these big conferences, and you're a John Piper or Tim Keller or whatever, and inevitably you're blessed by them, your horizons are expanded, it's a wonderful thing. Yet at the same time, there are an awful lot of ordinary pastors, like about 99% of us, who come away feeling a bit threatened, or I can never do that, and there can actually be some discouragement. Whereas my father was a quintessential ordinary pastor. He was born in Ireland, but grew up in Canada, and developed, in the mercy of God, a real concern for French Canada, where there were very few evangelical churches, just a smattering in a population of about 6.5 million. And he worked through all of the tough years, from the end of the 30s until he died 16 years ago. And during those tough years, for one period of time, for example, ministers were regularly beaten up and thrown in jail. Between 50 and 52, when I was just a little gaffer, Baptist ministers alone spent a total of 8 years in jail. And even when there was not that sort of thing, that only lasted a short while, but it was 2 steps forward, 1 step back. It was very, very difficult, challenging work. And he faced some struggles in the denomination and in his own doubts for himself and so on. But one of the things that was wonderful was his perseverance, and he kept journals for a lot of that time, so we could see his prayer life and his care for all kinds of people. And he nursed my mother through the Alzheimer's years. And
how long did she have Alzheimer's?
She was mugged at the age of 72, and symptoms started showing up right away, and 9 years later she died. So 9 years, in effect.
Wow.
And after she died, he started preaching again.
Did he preach?
By this time he was 78.
Did your dad preach your mom's funeral?
No. But on the other hand, in one sense, the funeral was a release. With Alzheimer's, you've already said all your goodbyes, months and months, years before sometimes. By the time she had gone, by the time she died, she didn't recognize anybody. 3 months earlier, 4 months earlier, you could hold her hand, and her eyes were vacant, and then you sing "Blessed Assurance," some old hymn or something, or quote something from the King James Version, and she'd get a little squeeze back, By the end, there was nothing, just nothing. So you've said your goodbyes, and by the time you actually get to the funeral, it's not as shattering as when somebody goes very quickly. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And then he started preaching and teaching, and in his journals, for example, he recorded. He was about 80 at the time. Words to this effect: "Save me from the sins of old men." A tendency to look backward and idealize the past. The temptation to resent younger men coming along who are more successful than I was. Too quick to turn on the television because I'm lonely. Insufficient intercessory prayer for my grandchildren. He just goes down and lists this long thing, and then he says, "Save me from the sins of old men." And you realize there's a candor to him that was, it wasn't fake. What you saw was what you got. And I've long thought, as I've looked at my parents, that the worst kind of Christian home in which to grow up is the one where there are large spiritual pretensions, but low spiritual performance. The best kind of Christian home to grow up in is the one where there are low spiritual pretensions, but quite high spiritual performance. Because the best stuff is caught, not just taught.
Yeah, and with your dad, he loved your mom for 9 years with Alzheimer's,
Yep.
and he was not young, so that was a great deal of work. How long did he pastor the church, and how big was it?
Well, most of he started off in an English language church while he was learning French in Montreal. Then he switched to the French side and started something from nothing. And it was only a few families. Then he moved into Drummondville to start a church there, and he was there for 16 years. And it was bilingual, so there was both an English congregation and a French congregation. And Sunday morning on a good Sunday, you probably get 40 to 45 on the English side, 35 on the French side on a good Sunday. and a lot of Sundays weren't good. And when he moved up to Al, he worked with another man there. And for most of the tough years, a congregation of 50 was substantial. And then after 1972, we saw something close to revival. In French Canada as a whole, there were about 35, 36 evangelical churches, and we grew in 8 years from 35, 36 churches to just under 500.
Wow.
And some of them were several hundred people, which by our standards was enormous. And by that time, Dad was already in his 60s, and the leadership was falling on younger men and so on. But he became, at that point, one of the, it's hard to know what to call them, the venerable old men of Quebec. I mean, there were so many of these young guys coming along that were very keen, but had no background, no knowledge, no real grasp. He was still having his devotions in Greek, and knowledge of Scripture that was pretty profound, and years and years of pastoral experience. He ran for years what he called la pastorale, which means something like the pastoral group, where he brought in a whole group of young pastors from the Outaouais region, the Ottawa Valley, and they all would come to his place early on Monday morning, stay for about 5 hours, and they'd pray for their people, work through theological questions, pastoral questions, and so on. He did that for years. And all that group of men, you talk to them today, they will tell you that they were shaped by Tom Carson. So that was part of the heritage that I grew up in.
In the hard and rough years for your dad, was he able to be working in ministry full-time, or did he have to be bivocational?
He was full-time until about the age of 50, or I've forgotten the exact year now. And then, because of some complex circumstances, he was bivocational. He worked as a federal government translator until the mandatory retirement age. And then, although he was retired and had some pension from the government, in fact, he worked virtually full-time in the local French church and in doing translating for the French work in Quebec.
In that time, did he get other offers to go elsewhere,
Yes.
bigger churches, more money?
He got a lot of offers to go into English Canada. Because of some things that had happened in the denomination in the late 40s, early 50s, he was actually a well-known man. He had taken some very painful steps on a matter of principle, and without rancor, he had held his head high. But as a result of that, there were many, many leaders in the churches in English Canada that held him in high regard. And several of them came knocking on his door and asking him to come and so on. But his heart was in French Canada. That's the way it was going to be. And so he wouldn't have considered a move.
Did he ever explain to you, son, this is why we're not moving, this is why we're not leaving?
Oh, and I was about 14, 15, something like that. Some things that happened that started in Africa. What was then the Belgian Congo erupted in civil war into what became the Congo, then Zaire, and so forth, as it was throwing off the yoke of colonialism. And during that strife, a lot of the missionaries, including American missionaries, left and went back home. And they started looking around for another part of the world that had French. And so some of them, inevitably, in America, then looked north across the border to French Canada. And so some of them came up into French Canada. And at the time, I was first or second year of high school. I was pretty young. But you see these people coming in, and inevitably there was sort of new encouragement. This will be wonderful, all of these people with lots of experience. Not one of them lasted more than 6 months. And with all the self-righteousness that only a 13 or 14-year-old can muster, I said to Dad, what's the matter with these people? Don't they have any grit, any stamina, any backbone? Why are they all wimping out just because it's a little tough? And he said, he was the mildest of men. He said, Don, you've got to understand, where they've been, where they have served, they have seen the grace of God in abundance. They have planted churches, whole denominations, started Bible schools, run hospitals. They've just seen lots and lots and lots of fruit. They come here and see how tough it is, and they take it as a sign that this can't be where God wants them, because being where God wants you means, in their minds, that there's lots of fruit. So I said to him with only the stupidity of a 13-year-old, well, then why don't you go someplace where you can make more of your life? And he wheeled on me, and he said, I stay because I believe God has many people in this place, and walked out of the room. Which, of course, is exactly the words that were given to Paul in Corinth when he was discouraged. You know, he was using election as a ground for hope and perseverance and stamina. That's right.
How do you think you'd be different if you wouldn't have had that father?
Oh, who's to know? Because what other father there would be? I mean, you know, and all three of us kids responded somewhat differently to those hard years.
Ask it a different way. What positive benefits came to your character from being shaped and formed in that environment? What things do you thank God for saying?
Oh, yeah, yeah. Well, one is the one that I've already mentioned. That is, my parents, whatever else they were or were not, I don't want to idealize them and make them out to super saints or something like
No,
that.
we're Calvinists. They're totally depraved.
Yeah, that's right.
But you can still love them.
But there was no phoniness to them. Kids have a very powerful phoniness snifter.
Yeah, especially previous generations of evangelical Christianity. Authenticity wasn't a huge value on behalf of the minister
That's right.
and his wife.
That's right. Yeah, let me tell you another story. I mentioned that my dad had gone through a really nasty crisis concerned with a man, we'll call him Joe, but in fact he was an astonishingly well-known preacher in Canada, an extremely gifted man, and he had ended up doing some amazingly corrupt things, and my father was the butt of all of that. Now, when I grew up, I only heard good things about Joe, just wonderful stories, so on. Then eventually, years later, I'd done chemistry and math. I was going away from anything to do with pastoral theology. I wasn't heading in that direction. Then the Lord called me into the ministry, and I went to seminary. And in a course on Baptist history, I heard all about Joe and all of these developments and so on. And after the whole story was told, I found out that my father was one of these central figures in the whole flaming mess. And the last thing the teacher said was, one of the first things I want to see when I get to heaven is Tom Carson's crown. So the next time I got home, some weeks later, I said, I've been learning some things about 47, 48, 49. And Dad said, oh, yes. Are they true? Well, what did you learn? So I retold the story as I had heard it. And at that point, I hadn't read any of the documents. Now that my father's papers have come to him, I've read them all. But at that point, I had none of the documents. I just recounted the story as it was told to me in class. And I said, is that what happened? And he said, yeah, pretty close. I said, how come you've never told me? You never told my sister? You never told my brother? You never told us any of this stuff. Well, he said, there were two reasons. The first is, you're a son of the manse. So, although you see the gospel in the home and all of that, you see an awful lot of dirt. It's the way it is. And part of our job is to protect you from seeing too much dirt too young. You just didn't need to see that. You needed to be older. And he said, after it happened, Mark, that is my mother, his wife, Mark and I, we realized that we had to guard our own hearts. We knew we couldn't succumb to bitterness. So we made a vow that we would never, ever say a negative thing about Joe, and we've kept our vow. Well, you come from that kind of background, and if I shoot off my mouth somewhere against someone or something, I remember that story. I mean, I wish I could claim I always had the same high standards. And then perseverance, a willingness to recognize that success is not always measured by bigness. It can be measured by faithfulness and integrity. How a man treats his wife when she's got Alzheimer's. There's a very important book on Alzheimer's called The 36-Hour Day, written by a couple of doctors, that describes the various stages of Alzheimer's. Very helpful to us, that predicted what kind of behavior would be there and how to respond to it and so on. And there are predictable stages where they go through really angry patches and so on. But I think that sometimes the anger is the result of not knowing how to handle them, not knowing when to push back and when to just let them go with it. My mother never went through those degrees of anger, partly because my father was so incredibly gentle with her. I never heard him say anything like, this isn't the woman I married, or anything like that. It was always, she gave so much to make my ministry fruitful for 40 or 50 years, and the least I can do is pay some small part of it back. They're just, what do you do with that? So undoubtedly, whether I realize it or not, that helped shape me when my wife was so sick with cancer and I canceled everything. And that will in turn shape my kids and how they will someday handle their spouses. I mean, a lot of these things are passed on by modeling.
Yeah.
And so I don't want to deny the importance of words, but in the family, the words have to be anchored in actions, or else they're not only empty, they may actually be counterproductive.